Game genres must adapt to stay current. The point-and-click adventure learned this when its emphasis on narrative was incorporated into other genres like shooters to give us Deus Ex. But this is tricky business, because it's also important that these genres stick to their roots, otherwise they lose much of what made them great for the sake of staying current. With the gaming market continuing to push high-fidelity, high-octane, multiplayer-focused online content, it may be that the next genre on the chopping block is the tactical role-playing genre. With the exception of a couple of titles such as the Civilization series, tactical RPGs cater to more of a niche audience. Such slow, methodical, often exclusively single-player gameplay seems a charming relic of the past when compared to the considerably more popular real-time strategy games, which seem the logical progression of war games. Indeed, many of the titles released during the heyday of the TRPG, like Landgrisser, Shining Force, and Ogre Battle, have been largely forgotten in today's market, with the exception of one major player, one of the forerunners of the genre that continues to soldier on: Fire Emblem. After the trial by fire that was Fire Emblem Awakening, and the recent teaser for Fire Emblem If, it's worth taking a look at the humble beginnings from which the franchise came, and how it's evolved over time for both better and worse. In this series of videos, I'll be taking a look at the highs and lows of several games in the series, discussing 3 core elements of what makes a Fire Emblem game work, and how and why those elements have changed over the years. So if that sounds fascinating, I hope you'll join me for the next several videos as we take a look at the rise and fall of Fire Emblem. Despite appearances, tactical RPGs don't pretend to imitate actual war. Instead, they draw on traditional one-on-one strategy games like chess and Go, in which mental stamina, the ability to plan ahead and read the opponent are much more important than the ability to micromanage and make lightning-quick decisions. And while not all of these elements translate well into video games, for the most part they are easily systemized, and it remains a fairly well-established genre with instantly recognizable gameplay. In most tactical RPGs, the player controls a finite number of units placed onto an isometric playing field and directs those units' actions. The player achieves victory by completing set objectives, often seizing control of certain locations on a map or defeating enemies. However, TRPGs aren't for everybody. A single level, for example, can last anywhere from 10 minutes to upwards of an hour depending on how thorough the player is. And factoring in that one false step or one overestimation of your unit's abilities can spill a game over, they can lead to some truly harrowing experiences. The year 1990 saw the first real example of the tactical role-playing genre with Intelligent Systems' Fire Emblem Ankokuryu to Hikari no Tsurugi. It was developed on a shoestring budget with only a handful of people working on it, 3 of whom were students at the time. The director of the project admits that it wasn't even really a product to be sold, it was more of an experiment than anything else. The idea was to take the gameplay of Famicom Wars and blend it with the story and progression mechanics of an RPG, and to everyone's surprise, it worked remarkably well. This initial foray into the genre set itself apart with what was then a unique aesthetic harkening back to the European Middle Ages, Arthurian legend, and the mythologies of several different cultures. This first Fire Emblem also established many of the gameplay conventions which remain in the series to this day. A simple but elegant combat system in which a variety of units move and trade attacks back and forth, a basic terrain system that affects the evade rate and movement for some units, an experience system and promotion option for units that level up to 10 or higher, and of course the series' permanent death mechanic. Characterization was found in the narrative, which told the story of Marth, a prince driven from his kingdom by the neighboring country of Dolar. With the help of a handful of loyal troops and friends, Marth sets out to find the holy sword Falchion, and the device that enables him to wield it, the Fire Emblem, in order to defeat not only Dolar, but the dark dragon Medeus as well. The surprising success of this first game spawned a series that now spans 14 games in which Intelligent Systems have continued to tweak and add to these core mechanics. But while the first game is certainly important to the franchise, and the third game, Mystery of the Emblem, was far and away the most successful game in the series financially, many longtime followers of the series consider Fire Emblem to really have hit its stride in 1996, with the release of the fourth game, Genealogy of the Holy War, and it's not hard to see why, as it added notable improvements to 2 of what many consider to be Fire Emblem's main strengths as a game: its punishing gameplay and character development. Genealogy was the first to utilize the weapons triangle, a rock-paper-scissors relationship among the types of weapons that added a further level of complexity to the combat, as well as skills, which gave the characters abilities they could use in combat and could also be passed on to their children, giving the units a level of customization. Genealogy also boasted considerably longer chapters than those found in previous titles, and absolutely enormous maps on which those chapters took place. But the most important mechanics are tied to the characters and their development, which is where Genealogy really shines. It was the first game to really dabble in character development, mostly via the love system, in which characters could accumulate love points from standing or fighting near each other, and eventually would fall in love, at which point the two would benefit from additional perks like lover criticals. This love mechanic not only played a significant role in determining the selection of units, equipment, and money available in the second half of the game, but also gave the characters less integral to the plot distinct personalities. While the addition of a personality isn't absolutely necessary for a good turn-based tactics game, it does help to avoid mind-numbingly boring gameplay like that of Advance Wars, and ultimately heightens the stakes of the battle. It's not tank 3-5-6 you risk losing, it's tilt you, who in just one more level can promote and is really close to falling in love with Azul. While it's hard to say that any character development in Fire Emblem is really profound, many of the characters in Genealogy at least feel like characters in their own right, each with their own motivation, arc, and place in the war. While there may be 5 or 6 conversations available per map, few exchanges in Genealogy feel unnecessary. Characters generally don't talk unless they have something important to say. The first time a player encounters a character serves as an introduction. We get to know the character and what makes him or her tick. If the player chooses to pair 2 characters, at certain major plot points they'll have exchanges, and occasional other chats along the way flesh out the character. This all sounds very straightforward and obvious, but let's look at Lex to illustrate. We meet Lex and his friend Azul in the prologue, where we see that he's brash, confident, and also a bit playful. If he speaks with Sigurd, we learn even more about him. That he's the son of Lord Langbart, that their fathers don't get along, and that Lex is fighting simply to help out Azul, and while respectful to Sigurd, doesn't really care much at all for him or his reasons for fighting. As the story progresses though, Lex changes his tune considerably, but in a realistic way, and in Chapter 5, after facing off against and killing Lord Langbart, Lex tells Azul that his father had it coming, showing that his own sense of justice has developed after fighting with Sigurd, and seeing the atrocities of the war his father wrought firsthand. Consider as well the main character Sigurd. While his tale starts as little more than an impulsive rescue mission to save a childhood friend, his being torn between helping his friends and doing what's fundamentally right, while at the same time being forced to follow the orders of people whose motivations he doesn't really understand, leads to a full-scale war in which Sigurd finds himself trapped and really put through the ringer, losing his status, his father, 2 of his best friends, his sister, his niece, his wife, his child, and ultimately his life at the hands of a person whom he thought was a friend. And along the way we see Sigurd question the righteousness of the war and struggle to justify his actions to those he cares about, and it's hard not to feel for him at times. Sigurd is the picture of the classic tragic hero, a character undone by a fatal flaw. And while it's nothing groundbreaking, even in video games, the fact that his tale injects doubt into the player is worth noting, as it's something you almost never see in modern games that are overly focused on making the player feel empowered. Genealogy does just the opposite. The last few lines of the first generation are heartbreaking. Even many of the antagonists are complex, having their own reasons for fighting and going against the protagonists. Thracia, for example, is first alluded to in the prologue as something Quan needs to worry about, but their position isn't entirely unreasonable. King Trabant wants the same thing Quan does, to unite the struggling Thracia and the prosperous Manster that share the same region, so they can both mutually benefit. Trabant may go about the unification in the wrong way, but it's hard to say that his motivations are entirely evil. Even Alvis genuinely seems to care for his brother, and at the 11th hour we see that while Alvis does desire to be king, he wants the power for noble reasons, and plays unwittingly into the hands of the big bad in much the same way that Sigurd did. Perhaps the most important point to take away about these conversations in Genealogy is that throughout them the characters never feel isolated from the greater conflict. In most conversations, friends offer help in the form of stats or weapons for the coming battles, some express concern over their loved ones being in combat, and sometimes the characters more in the know discuss the political machinations going on in the background. The characters all feel like they belong in the world, but like parts of a bigger whole. Ultimately, it's characters like Sigurd, Lex, and Alvis, complex, realistic ones with which players can sympathize and relate to, or at the very least understand, that creates memorable characters. The narrative of Genealogy is a heady mix of lineage, politics, corruption, and treason. It's one of those games that might take you a second playthrough before you sit down to write a character flowchart. It's told in an entirely linear manner, but there are a lot of characters and there is a lot going on. The joint director and writer himself, Shozo Kaga, even expressed concerns that it was perhaps too complex and would alienate players, but this proved silly, as many people consider it to be one of the best in the series. We're introduced to the story with a long chronology highlighting the trials and tribulations of the continent of Zhugdraw. It mentions things like the Great Purge and children sacrificed to the Dark God and tens of thousands of casualties. It's not a cheery account. A handful of crusaders blessed by the gods sort things out though and found the nations that we'll come to be familiar with. But just a little over 100 years pass before the disturbance begins anew. Granbel's army is busy dealing with hostilities in the east, and the rather empty Granbel is tempting for the formerly friendly King Bato of Verdane, who sends his sons to invade. For his efforts defending Granbel, Sigurd is made into a proper knight of the realm beholden to the king, and things only get more complicated from there. There are people pulling the strings who want to unite the blood of the descendants of Sigyn, who do happen to be siblings by the way, in order to reawaken the Dark Lord Lapitosu. Meanwhile, while fighting in Augustria, Sigurd suddenly receives word that he and his father are suspected of having played a part in the murder of the Prince of Granbel and have been branded traitors. We soon learn that Langbart and Repter are actually behind the murder, but with Alvis's influence over the king and Repter's sway as prime minister, anyone who can prove Sigurd's innocence is unable to do anything about it. The close of the first generation sees Sigurd and his army walk into a trap set by Alvis and ends with a surprisingly affecting scene. I have almost no problems with this first half of the game. Again, the characters are great and there's a lot of care put into making them into realistic characters. They have clear motivations, struggles, and arcs, and there's even a scene toward the end where most of them either renew or reaffirm their motivations or clear the air. I also like that a fair number of the enemies have nothing to do with Manfloy and his goals, but are motivated by purely selfish reasons like any normal person. Langbart and Repter feel slighted. Shagall loathes seeing Granbel take control of his nation, and Trabant seeks to unify the Thracia Peninsula by force. Narratively, there are sudden developments and twists influenced by events occurring off-screen that manage not to feel contrived, and some genuinely tragic scenes as well. All of this isn't to say that Genealogy is perfect though, because it's not. Shozo Kaga confesses that the team didn't have quite enough time to flesh out the second half of the game, and sadly it shows. The biggest problem is that, with the exception of maybe the Thracia arc, the second half of the game feels terribly rushed. After Sigurd's unfortunate death, we pick up again 17 years later. Alvis's utopia hasn't exactly panned out, and a burgeoning liberation army is just gaining momentum. The leader of that army is none other than Sigurd's son Celis. We soon meet our old friend Levin, who takes over Oyfe's role as advisor to the army, and from there we do what a liberation army is wont to do. Free nations, inspire people, recruit unlikely allies, and so on. The Thracia arc is handled pretty well. It contains all the drama you'd expect. Altena learns that Trabant isn't her real father, meets her real brother, and is suitably torn about what she should do. Celis wonders if the battle against Thracia is really worth fighting, and of course Trabant's surprisingly noble death. Later we see that the Big Bad has actually achieved his goal of uniting the blood of the Lopt clan into a single person who can tap into the power of Lapitosu, and as a result history is very close to repeating itself. Children are being rounded up and sacrificed to the Dark God, and people are living in a perpetual state of fear, praying for the return of the Crusaders. One nice touch that really drives home the importance of lineage in Genealogy is that in the beginning of the second generation, Celis' army is simply called the Liberation Army, but soon more and more people begin referring to them as the Crusaders. First it's just Levin, but then there's the townsfolk, and then the children. It serves to highlight one of the themes of the game, and it's a really charming little bit you can miss if you're not paying attention. Later we get a bit of a plot dump where we learn that Holy Blood is actually Dragon Blood, and the means by which the Crusaders inherited their power is the very same way that Archbishop Gall formed his covenant with Lapitosu. There are, however, some suspiciously similar plot threads, like how Deirdre and Julia both suffer from memory loss and both mysteriously disappear later in the story. Characterization also suffers considerably in the second half. It has its moments, but many of the recruitment chats become formulaic, mentioning the character's name, class, parents, and how great it is that he or she is now on the good side. Not to mention that most other chats in the second half focus on the parents much more than the characters now doing the fighting. Few characters have arcs, and those that do feel rushed. Alessa's entire arc in particular, which is laughable considering how much screen time his father got. And while I do like the mentoring bits with Levin and Celis, I would have liked to see Celis take the initiative himself at least once. He seems to just go along with whatever Levin says and never really thinks for himself. There's no denying that Genealogy stumbles a bit at the last hurdle, and while it is a shame, it may be what prompted Shozo Kaga to take just a fraction of this complex story and really explore it in his next game, Thracia 776. Nevertheless, for many people, Genealogy stands as quite a high point in Fire Emblem due to its adding a good deal of complexity to the series on all fronts. But that's it for this video. In the next installment we'll be taking a look at Sword of Seals. I'll see you then.